Welcome and thank you for joining us for another deep dive. Today, we're stepping into a really vital topic, I think, for anyone seeking to cultivate a life of, well, spiritual vitality and clarity. We're going to unpack some compelling insights on the practice of reading, but not just any reading, right? We're talking about reading that nourishes the soul and guards against spiritual barrenness, especially as it relates to those called to lead in ministry. This is reformed thinking, and we're here to help you gain understanding quickly with some surprising facts and hopefully illuminating perspectives. Our mission today is to sift through the insights of, well, thinkers many of you will know: John Piper, C.S. Lewis, Martin Lloyd-Jones, Charles Spurgeon, all of whom saw reading as a truly central discipline. We've got a stack of materials here that lay out this case and will guide you through the most, let's say, gripping nuggets, trying to offer a clear structure and memorable details along the way. So you might want to grab your own notebook because this deep dive is really custom tailored to help you grasp what it means to truly feed your soul through the written word. We're going to look at the kind of spiritual battle involved, some practical ways to make time for it, why quality maybe outweighs quantity, and why drawing from voices of the past isn't just a nice idea, but maybe essential for spiritual health today. Okay, let's unpack this first bit. Our sources kick off with a declaration that's, well, quite striking. For a pastor, reading isn't just a good habit, it's a fight for one's life. That sounds intense. What exactly is going on here? Why is the language so stark?
Yeah, that language from Martin Lloyd-Jones, it really does grab you, doesn't it? He literally states that one has to fight for one's life just to secure reading time. He even suggests, someone calls the pastor, they should just be told the pastor is not available. Now, that's not about being like rude or unhelpful. It just shows the extreme level of dedication required. The sources say pastors must fight for your mornings and protect those life-giving hours. And this extends even to gathering up some of the vanishing moments throughout the day, little bits of time. It's about seeing this time as absolutely essential, something you have to defend, with real vigor, because the stakes are just so high for their spiritual well-being and their calling. This isn't presented as like a leisure activity or nice to have. It's framed as spiritual survival for the leader. It really means a radical reordering of priorities, where feeding your own soul becomes, well, non-negotiable on the schedule. It's almost like a soldier guarding supplies in enemy territory. You do what you have to do because your life depends on it.
Right. So given that framing, what does this actually mean for the pastor's spiritual well-being day to day? Why is it such an intense battle?
Well, that gets to the core of it, doesn't it? Why the fight? Pastors face this constant intellectual and spiritual drain. Just think about it. The demands are relentless. They're preparing, 2 or 3 new messages a week. They're wrestling with family pain from their congregation, making complex church decisions, and often navigating these really tough, imponderable theological and moral dilemmas. Think about the sheer volume of spiritual and emotional energy that takes. The analogy used is pretty frightening. A pastor is not a self-replenishing spring. That really hits home. Their spirit does not revive on the run. You can't just refuel spiritually while you're dashing between appointments. Imagine a well, right? In a village, it's constantly being drawn from. Everyone needs water. But if that well never gets refilled, if the springs feeding it dry up, it quickly becomes empty. Everyone goes thirsty. And that's the picture painted for a pastor who neglects this dedicated time. Without unhurried reading and reflection beyond the press of sermon preparation, the soul just shrinks. And then this phrase, the specter of ministerial death rises. Now, that's not physical death, obviously.
It's a spiritual one, a deep internal kind of withering. The constant demands, without dedicated input and nourishment, lead to, well, severe depletion. Consistent reading is described as a vital lifeline. It's how the well gets refilled, you see. It's how the pastor keeps drawing from God's truth, not just for others, but for their own soul's life. Without it, the well runs dry, and the ministry itself loses its vitality. It's quite a sobering picture, and it really underscores why this isn't just a suggestion, it's a spiritual necessity.
And if this battle for reading time is lost, what's the real terrifying consequence? The thing the authors really warn against. What is that specter you mentioned?
Yeah, the sources highlight a very specific concern. The beginnings of barrenness that come from frenzied activity with little spiritual food and meditation. Barrenness. It's a spiritual dryness. A lack of real productivity, not in terms of, numbers or programs, but genuine spiritual fruitfulness. And it's portrayed as something to be genuinely concerned about, even frightened of. This spiritual dryness, it doesn't just affect the pastor's own soul, making it shrink or harden. It directly impacts their ability to lead the church, to pour out truth with authenticity, to genuinely minister life to others. Think about a garden, maybe. It gets no water, no nutrients. Doesn't matter how much sun it gets or how carefully you arrange the plants. If there's no spiritual food coming in, it just becomes desolate. The vibrancy vanishes, things wilt, no fruit grows. That's the opposite of, well, a vibrant spiritual life, isn't it? And it's shown as a direct consequence of lacking nourishment, which deep reading provides. The fear is that the well runs dry, and there's just nothing left to offer. Not just to the congregation, but for the pastor's own relationship with God.
It's the loss of spiritual vitality, personal joy, and ultimately effectiveness. The sermons might become dry, academic perhaps, the counsel given might lack wisdom, and the pastor themselves to become cynical, exhausted, basically spiritually burned out. That's the specter they describe.
This connects to a really compelling distinction mentioned in our sources. Pastors are urged to be prayerful, spiritual poets rather than productive managers. That's a fascinating contrast. Can you tell us more about that? What does it really mean for ministry?
Yeah, that contrast between the productive manager and the prayerful spiritual poet is very telling. It really gets to the heart of what the church truly needs from its leaders. On one hand, you've got this contemporary drive, right, to be productive managers. This mindset focuses on efficiency, tasks, metrics, quantifiable results in ministry. It often emphasizes administrative skill, growth numbers, strategic plans, program development, getting things done, running a tight ship. And look, there's definitely a place for good administration, nobody's denying that, but the authors argue this isn't the primary call. The true need of the church, they say, is for prayerful spiritual poets. Now, that doesn't mean pastors who literally write verse, although some might. It means pastors whose inner life is so saturated with God's reality that it shapes their entire being, their whole outlook. These are pastors who feel the weight and glory of eternal reality, even in the midst of a business meeting. Can you picture that? A difficult church board meeting, tough decisions, maybe a crisis. A productive manager might focus just on the logistics, the problem solving, the people dynamics. But the spiritual poet approaches it from a different place internally. They're aware of God's presence, His sovereignty, His character, even in the middle of all the noise and pressure. They carry such a sense of God that they provide by their very presence a constant life-giving reorientation on the infinite God. What that means is their demeanor, their counsel, their sermons, even just their quiet presence can act as a kind of spiritual anchor for people. They radiate a certain God consciousness that helps others lift their eyes beyond the immediate stuff to the bigger reality of God's kingdom and His purposes. And that kind of posture, that internal reservoir of spiritual reality, well, it isn't cultivated through efficiency manuals or management seminars. It requires deep internal feeding, nurtured by rich reading, by unhurried reflection, by a life of prayer. It's this internal vitality, not just administrative skill, that truly ministers life. It's about embodying a genuine connection with God that flows out, influencing everything, rather than just, overseeing a religious organization.
That picture of the spiritual poet, that really resonates. It shifts the focus from external metrics to an internal reality, doesn't it? But okay, for anyone with a busy schedule pastor or not finding time for rich reading can feel, well, impossible sometimes. Our sources shed light on a discovery about making this possible, even in short bursts. I think this will be really practical for a lot of folks listening.
Yes, this is where the strategy offered becomes really compelling and frankly encouraging. The author talks about making an astonishing discovery. His words about reading in disciplined blocks of 20 minutes a day. And the key thing is, this frees you from what he calls the paralysis of not starting great, mind-shaping, heart-enriching books because I lacked enough big blocks of time. You know that feeling, right? You look at a big, important book and think, I need a whole Saturday for this. And so it just sits there. So many people feel that if they can't set aside a full hour, maybe two, there's no point even beginning something substantial. And that means those deeper, maybe more challenging, but ultimately more rewarding books, they just never get opened. This approach just shatters that barrier. It's based on the idea that consistency and discipline, applied in these relatively short intervals, can achieve way more than maybe sporadic, longer sessions that are hard to keep up. The astonishing discovery wasn't some new reading technique. It was about the psychological freedom and the actual progress you gain by breaking an intimidating task into manageable pieces. It's about harnessing those small moments in the day that might otherwise just get lost to, scrolling or distraction, and intentionally directing them towards this soul-nourishing input. So this disciplined approach, it isn't just a trick, it's a strategic way to weave substantial reading into a busy life, turning the seemingly impossible into something tangible.
So, how much can someone actually read in these 20-minute blocks? Let's get practical. Give us the numbers. I think listeners would appreciate seeing the scale of this.
Okay, the calculations are pretty eye-opening. They really show the cumulative power of small, consistent effort. So if you read at about say 250 words per minute, which is a fairly average speed for taking things in, then 20 minutes allows for roughly 5,000 words. Now, to put that in context, an average book often has around 400 words to a page, give or take. So if you do the math, that's about 12 and a half pages in just 20 minutes. Now, let's take that further. If a pastor, or really anyone, disciplines themselves to read just 20 minutes a day, say 6 days a week, for a whole year, that adds up to 312 dedicated reading sessions. And when you multiply those 12 and a half pages by 312 sessions, that comes out to 900 pages over the course of a year. So assuming an average book is maybe 250 pages long, that means you could read 15 books of that size in 1 year, just from those consistent 20-minute blocks. This isn't just theory, it's a practical demonstration of how these small efforts compound into something really significant over time. It really challenges that common belief that you need huge chunks of time for serious reading. Shows the hidden potential in our schedules, really.
15 books in a year, just from 20 minutes a day. That's quite something. It opens up a whole world of possibilities, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Does this strategy apply to the classic longer works too? You know, the ones that look really daunting on the shelf?
Oh, absolutely. This disciplined approach is particularly great for tackling those major classic works that might otherwise just sit there intimidating you. For instance, John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, foundational text, right, often runs to 1,500 pages or so. Using this method, you could actually complete it in just 25 weeks. Think about that. A cornerstone theological work, often seen as a lifetime study, becomes accessible in half a year just by dedicating 20 minutes a day. And after that, you could tackle other significant texts, maybe Augustine's The City of God, or a B.B. Warfield's Inspiration and Authority of the Bible. You could finish those before the year's end, too. It shows how even the most formidable works become manageable when you break them down into these consistent bite-sized pieces. The material also suggests, multiplying these blocks. If you could find 20 minutes early morning, maybe another 20 after lunch, and 20 before bed, you could potentially read something like 36 medium-sized books annually. It really just illustrates the power of consistent discipline, turning seemingly small efforts into substantial intellectual and spiritual growth. It's about making progress consistently, rather than waiting for some ideal, uninterrupted time that, let's be honest, rarely shows up.
That's a powerful picture of consistency. Every moment counts. Now, John Stott is also mentioned with a thought on minimum reading time. What does he suggest, maybe for those who feel even more pressed for time?
Yeah, John Stott offers a slightly different angle, but it complements the same idea. He speaks particularly to the busiest pastors, but really it applies to anyone with a demanding schedule. He suggests an hour a day as an absolute minimum for time for study. Now, an hour might still sound like a lot to some people, but Stott points out that this daily habit, which seems small day to day, adds up to nearly 600 hours in a year. And he observes that everybody who tries it is surprised to discover how much reading can be done within such a disciplined framework. So what Scott's observation reinforces is the same core principle we saw with the 20-minute blocks. Structured reading, even for what might seem like relatively short periods each day, yields really substantial rewards over time. It pushes back against the notion that you need massive free blocks of time for serious study or deep spiritual nourishment. Instead, it's the regularity, the discipline of setting aside that time day after day that allows for absorbing a vast amount of material and cultivating a strong inner life. It's about making spiritual feeding a daily rhythm, like eating. Consistency is the key to growth.
So it's clearly not just about finding the time, crucial as that is. It's also very much about how we read. And our sources make a strong case for focusing on quality over quantity, which I imagine might cut against the grain for some modern habits.
That's exactly right. The sources give a direct warning against superficial reading, which feels particularly relevant today, in our information overload age. Charles Spurgeon, himself an incredibly wide reader, but also deep, he states that a student will find that his mental constitution is more affected by one book thoroughly mastered than by 20 books which he has merely skimmed lapping at them. That's a significant point, isn't it? It suggests that a deep, engaged interaction with one book shapes your mind, your character, your soul, far more truly than just lightly touching on many. It points to a different kind of spiritual formation, one that values depth and actually absorbing the truth, rather than just, ticking off titles or racking up numbers. It's about real digestion, not just tasting.
And why is this depth considered so crucial? What's the real downside of just, keeping up with Pastor Jones by skimming a dozen new books a month?
Well, thinking about that more broadly, the author agrees completely with Spurgeon here. He warns that superficiality only feeds pride and breeds spiritual barrenness. That's a critical insight, I think. The temptation to skim, often driven by wanting to seem knowledgeable or keep up appearances or just consume lots of content, ultimately hinders real spiritual growth. It can create a kind of facade of knowledge without true understanding settling in. And it can feed pride, because you might feel informed without having done the hard work of really wrestling with the ideas. Instead, the consistent call from these authors is to devote yourself to boring in and going deep into books, to gain soul-refreshing, heart-deepening, mind-enlarging truth. This goes directly against that temptation just to consume lots of books without letting them sink in and actually reshape your inner life. Superficial reading might give you the appearance of knowledge, yeah? It might let you drop names and titles, but it won't yield genuine spiritual vitality or real wisdom or depth of character. It won't satisfy the soul's hunger. True depth allows the truth to become part of you, to alter your perspective, to actually nourish your spirit. That leads to fruit, not barrenness. It's almost like allowing the book to read you, in a sense, and reshape your internal landscape.
This idea of deep reading leads us straight into some strong advice that comes up repeatedly in our sources, the counsel to read old books.
Yeah.
Why are these older texts considered so vital for our spiritual and intellectual diet today? It might seem a bit counterintuitive to some people.
Yeah, it's a critical question. Why the emphasis on old books? C.S. Lewis gives a remarkably clear answer, and he offers a good rule for reading that many people have found helpful. He proposes that, after reading a new book, never to allow yourself another new one till you have read an old one in between. Harris. Now, if that feels too strict, he gives a slightly less demanding option, at least one old one to every 3 new ones. The point isn't to reject contemporary thought entirely. It's about ensuring a balance, and more than that, a corrective influence on your thinking and spiritual formation. It's a deliberate strategy to stop our minds from being solely shaped by whatever the prevailing ideas of our own specific moment happen to be.
That's a very specific discipline he suggests. What's the thinking behind Lewis's rule? Why is that balance so necessary?
Lewis argues that every era, every age, has its own characteristic mistakes and its own characteristic blindness. These are the assumptions, the biases, the ways of thinking that are so common in a particular time that people living in it just can't fully see them. We're all, products of our time to some extent. Our perspectives are shaped by its particular leanings, which we might not even realize we have. For example, our current age might lean heavily towards individualism, maybe, or an overemphasis on immediate results, or a view of truth that's entirely subjective. These could be our blindnesses, and they're hard to spot when you're swimming in them. Lewis says that reading old books is the only palliative, for that's the only remedy, the only corrective. They provide the necessary perspective to correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period. I know. When you read a book written, say, 500 years ago, you encounter a mind shaped by totally different cultural assumptions, different ideas about life, God, humanity. And by engaging with those different thought patterns, you start to see the hidden assumptions of your own time more clearly. He talks about allowing the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds. That's a great image, isn't it? Captures that refreshing, clarifying effect of stepping outside our immediate cultural bubble. It's like opening a window and letting fresh air clear out the stale air of our unexamined assumptions. It helps us see our own biases and maybe avoid the pitfalls our own age is prone to.
He also has a rather interesting take on who should read these older texts, especially in theology. You might assume they're just for scholars, right?
That's a really good point. What's compelling is Lewis's observation of what he calls a strange idea abroad. This idea that only professionals, only scholars, should read the ancient books, particularly theological ones, while amateurs, regular folks, should stick to modern stuff. He finds this completely topsy-turvy, totally upside down. He argues that if he were forced to choose between reading only new books or only old books, he would absolutely advise reading the old. And his reasoning is quite clear. New books are still unproven. We don't know yet which of their ideas will last and which will turn out to be the characteristic mistakes of our time. But the old books, they've already been filtered through centuries of readers. They've survived precisely because they contain enduring truth. Therefore, for the person seeking a solid foundation, for the amateur who needs firm footing, Lewis argues the old books are actually the safer and more beneficial choice. It really highlights the unique corrective and enriching value these older texts offer, suggesting their insights aren't just for specialists, but are fundamental for anyone wanting a robust understanding of God and Christian living. Our modern preference for the new often misses the enduring truths and the crucial perspective older works provide for living faithfully in any age.
This discussion of old books brings us neatly to a specific recommendation from our sources, the Puritans. Why are their writings singled out as particularly nourishing for the soul, especially for those in ministry, but really for anyone?
While digging into this, the distinction made about the content of spiritual reading is pretty significant. The sources express a kind of lament that much contemporary devotional material is just too light and too shallow and too atheological, that it often fails to truly convey the greatness of God and can leave the soul feeling, well, starving. Think of it like spiritual junk food, maybe. It might give you a momentary feeling of fullness, but it lacks the essential nutrients for sustained health and growth. This kind of material, though often well-meaning, can focus on surface-level feelings or practical tips without grounding them deeply in the rich doctrines of God's character, His holiness, His sovereignty, the work of Christ. It suggests a spiritual diet that's lacking real substance, unable to satisfy the soul's deepest hunger for God Himself. In contrast, older works, and especially those of the Puritans, are held up as providing a deeper, more substantial spiritual food. Food that can kindle a flame in your spirit and also offer gentle treatment for your soul. See, the Puritans weren't just academics. They were pastors, deeply concerned with applying biblical truth to everyday life, cultivating a deep experiential knowledge of God. Their writings are packed with doctrine, yes, but it's always aimed at stirring the affections and promoting practical holiness. It's this blend of robust theology and heartfelt piety that makes them so uniquely nourishing. They weren't afraid to go deep into doctrines like sin, grace, election, union with Christ, but they did it with an eye towards personal transformation and spiritual vitality.
Martin Lloyd-Jones, for example, shares a very personal, quite touching account of how a particular Puritan helped him during a really difficult time. Can you share that story?
Yes, it's a wonderful illustration of the practical value of these older texts. Lloyd-Jones talks about his deep gratitude for Richard Sibbes, specifically Sibbes' books, The Bruised Reed and The Soul's Conflict. Lloyd-Jones describes a time in his own ministry when he was overworked and badly overtired, something many in ministry and frankly many others can relate to. And he says that in that weary state, reading these books by Sibbes incredibly quieted, soothed, comforted, encouraged, and healed his soul. Just pause on that for a moment. He wasn't reaching for a quick fix or a management book. He reached for Puritan works, centuries old, and found genuine balm for his soul. The Bruised Reed, for instance, is known for its incredibly tender, compassionate approach to those struggling with sin and spiritual weakness, drawing comfort from Christ's gentle character. This just illustrates how these historical theological works aren't merely academic exercises. They offer real comfort, real healing for the soul in times of weakness, exhaustion, or spiritual struggle. They speak directly to the heart, providing solace and reorientation when maybe dense arguments are too much to handle. It really shows the practical, soul-sustaining nature of these older writings. Their relevance goes way beyond historical interest. They meet the real spiritual and emotional needs of people today, just like they did centuries ago.
And it's not just Sibbes, is it? Our sources list several other Puritan and classic authors that pastors, and really anyone seeking spiritual depth, should probably be familiar with and read. Are these books actually easy to get hold of?
Yeah, that brings up a really important point about access. The sources note that many pastors today may be immersed in contemporary books on management or church growth, don't even know such treasures for the soul exist. Which is a real shame, a huge missed opportunity for deep spiritual nourishment, because thankfully, these books are almost all still in print. There are publishers who specialize in keeping Reformed and Puritan works available, so they are readily accessible to anyone looking for this kind of spiritual food. You don't need to be a scholar digging through archives. J.I. Packer, who is a great scholar of Puritanism himself, is quoted saying that neglecting these readily available Puritan reprints impoverishes us grievously. He basically says we are spiritually poorer for ignoring this rich heritage, and he calls for an end to this neglect. Some specific authors mentioned for their soul-nourishing quality include Jonathan Edwards' Think of His Religious Affections, Exploring True Spiritual Experience, John Bunyan, obviously, with Pilgrim's Progress, Thomas Boston's Fourfold State, Jeremiah Burroughs' Christian Contentment, J.C. Ryle on Holiness, Charles Bridges on the Christian Ministry, Thomas Brooks' Precious Remedies Against Satan's Devices, John Flavel's Method of Grace. These aren't just historical artifacts. They're presented as living springs of truth for the Christian soul, offering wisdom, comfort, and guidance that really does transcend time.
Now, this rich reading, it isn't meant to be this isolated activity kind of separate from the rest of one's spiritual life, is it? Our sources suggest a strong connection between reading and other spiritual disciplines, particularly prayer. How does reading actually help us pray better, or maybe with more spiritual warmth?
This is a really beautiful aspect, I think. It underscores that this kind of reading isn't just about downloading information into your brain. What's compelling is how reading can become an organic part of, say, your morning prayer time. The idea is that reading something devotional, something substantial, can warm your spirit. It can help you get oneself into that frame and condition in which one can pray. You know those times when you sit down to pray, but your mind is just racing, or your heart feels cold, or you're just distracted by the to-do list? It can be hard to just jump into meaningful conversation with God. Lloyd Jones describes it as learning how to kindle a flame in your spirit. He even uses the analogy of a spiritual choke, like on an old car engine. You know, on a cold morning, you needed the choke to enrich the fuel mixture, warm the engine up, get it running smoothly before you could drive off. In the same way, spiritual reading can act like that choke for your soul. It focuses your mind on divine truths, reminds you of God's character, His promises. It helps bring your affections into line with His will. As you read about God's greatness, or the wonders of His grace, maybe your heart begins to soften, your desire for Him grows, and the world's distractions start to fade a bit. So this isn't just intellectual preparation. It's about cultivating a heart condition that's actually conducive to communion with God. Reading can quiet the inner noise, present specific biblical truths to shape your prayers around, and stir up a genuine hunger for God's presence. So instead of prayer feeling like a duty performed in spiritual coldness, it can become a more heartfelt, engaged experience. Flowing more naturally from a soul that's been warmed and directed by truth, the words on the page become fuel for devotion, guiding your thoughts and opening up new avenues for talking with the Lord.
So bringing this all together, what does this mean for you, our listener? This deep dive into the pastor's fight for soulful reading, it really offers a compelling blueprint for spiritual vitality that honestly extends far beyond just pastors. It reminds us that our souls, just like our bodies, need constant and nourishing food to really flourish.
Yeah, if you step back and look at the big picture, the core message seems pretty clear. Whether you're in formal ministry or just seeking to live a life shaped by spiritual depth in whatever context God has you. Fighting for time to engage with rich, life-giving books is presented as a fight for your very spiritual existence. It's about more than just gaining knowledge. It's about staying alive in your soul to keep the juices flowing, to fan the flame. And that applies to anyone who desires a vibrant walk with God, who wants to be spiritually nourished, fruitful, and frankly resilient in the face of life's challenges and the world's spiritual drain.
We've seen how dedicated, disciplined reading, even those 20-minute blocks, can yield really astounding results. It allows you to walk with giants of the faith, absorb so much truth. We've heard that compelling call to go deep, right? To master a few works rather than just skimming many. And we've hopefully understood the unique value of old books, especially the Puritans, in correcting our modern blind spots and providing true, substantial spiritual food that maybe a lot of contemporary stuff just can't offer. Our deepest gratitude goes to the authors of our sources, John Piper and the others we've mentioned, for these insights. Their words really do inspire a more disciplined and hopefully more spiritually fruitful approach to reading.
Which really brings up an important question for you, the listener, to think about this week. What small, disciplined step could you take, starting this week, to begin or maybe reignite your own fight for soul-nourishing reading? Perhaps it is setting aside a 20-minute block each morning, or maybe picking up one of those older works we talked about. How might consistent engagement with a truly significant book alter your spiritual landscape over the next year? Just imagine the growth, the clarity that could come from that kind of consistent spiritual feeding.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We trust this discussion has given you plenty to consider and maybe apply to your own walk with God. Until next time, keep seeking truth and fighting for your soul's true nourishment.